Okay, good morning or good evening, everybody, wherever you're following this event from. My name is Giovanni Cestino. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in ethnomusicology at the University of Milan. And together with my colleague Giovanni Albini, ukulelist, composer, and music theorist from Conservatorio of Alessandria, Italy, we are glad to welcome all of you to this first Ukulele International Conference 2021. So thanks for being here with us, both here on Zoom, our wonderful presenters for today and tomorrow, but also in our YouTube streaming for these 2 days conference. Before giving you a very brief introduction about this event, I would love to bring you greetings from the director of the Department of Cultural Heritage and Environment, Professor Alberto Bentoglio, who unfortunately is very busy with other academic duties. But he brings us his greeting and very good luck to this conference that we designed together with Giovanni to be a starting point for academic and expanded cultural world research on the ukulele. The first thing I would love to stress is the diversity that we would love to delve into. And I think that a glimpse of this diversity is easy to see at a glance if you look to the program of this conference. Our presenters wrote the name ukulele with different ways of spelling it. And I find it fascinating and an absolutely remarkable example of how this instrument really travels and encompasses many musical genre, musical scenes, and musical situations around the globe. The aim of this conference is to present you a wide array of brand new perspective on this instrument, both from an academic point of view. We will have prominent musicologists talking about different aspects of this instrument, but also to give you a fresh taste of the perspective that composers and performers can bring to a better understanding of the instrument. Last but not least, we also wanted to broaden the spectrum of our speakers to people who are deeply engaged in other professional careers that revolves around the instrument. We will have people making strings for ukulele and selling strings for this instrument, or people simply addressing a more general public through media, sharing the history and the current repertoire of the instrument. So before letting the conference begin, I have a few remarks and few communication for everybody who's following the YouTube streaming. So as you know, here on our Zoom room, we have all the speakers, and the audience can directly follow the presentation, the conference on YouTube. If you want to interact with the speakers, if you want to interact with questions or comments or thought, please feel free to drop your lines in the YouTube chat. They will automatically be addressed to our Zoom chat, and we will have time after the presentation to answer all the questions. But please drop the questions immediately when they appear in your mind, so we can organize them in advance. Okay, I think that this is the most important thing to say in order to let our audience interact with us. And so I think that we can get started with our conference. So I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker for today, which is Jonathan de Souza. Jonathan is an associate professor in the Don Wright Faculty of Music and an associate member of the Brain and Mind Institute at the University of Western Ontario. His book, Music at Hand, Instruments, Bodies, and Cognition, received an Emerging Scholar Award from the Society for Music Theory in 2020. And we are very, very glad to have Jonathan here today with a terrific keynote speech, which is entitled, "What Can You Do with an Ukulele? Instruments and Musical Affordances." So, Jonathan, I leave you the floor, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Giovanni. Thank you, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very honored to be a part of this. I'm going to share my screen and sound and get that started here. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm kind of particularly honored to be a part of this because I'm really not an expert on the ukulele. I love the instrument. I always have. I've kind of owned one since I was a child. We have a few of them in our house. I always enjoy playing it. But my expertise is really in music theory and music cognition. What I mainly do is try to use these different, scientific and humanistic perspectives to think about music. And a big question for me has been how we use instruments, how musical instruments are important for the ways that we make and experience music. So I'm going to, what I'm kind of hoping to do in this talk is provide a conceptual framework based on those kind of perspectives that can advance our conversation about the ukulele. And I know, probably some of my insights are going to be, obvious, I think, to the experts here, but and I know I'm going to learn so much from all of the rest of the program, but hopefully these ideas can help kind of stimulate something and help us to reflect on aspects of this instrument and its music in interesting ways. So what I'm going to do with the talk basically is I'm going to start by zooming way out, and I'm going to start just by talking about kind of, and then I'm gradually zoom in to music, to instruments, and finally to the ukulele itself and what makes it specific. So starting with cognitive science, I'm going to be drawing on a tradition within cognitive science called ecological psychology. This is probably an unfamiliar term to many of us. So what is ecological psychology? Well, it's an approach that emerged in the 1960s. In that decade, there were important books on the topic published by James Gibson, Roger Barker, and Eleanor Gibson, among others. And it's a fundamentally relational approach to thinking about psychology or to thinking about how the mind works or any of these kinds of questions. So if you think of an ecosystem, and this is kind of the metaphor that where this gets its name, right? You think of an ecosystem, there are many things going on in that ecosystem, right? There are different kinds of plants, trees, weeds, algae, these things. There are different kinds of animals, birds and insects and fish, and so on. And then there are resources like air and water, and all of these things are interacting and depending on each other, right? The animals have their own niche, their own place in the food chain. They have behaviors that rely on each other and all of these kinds of things, right? It's a rich environment. It's a rich ecosystem. And if you want to understand an animal like this stork on the screen, you can't just take it out of its environment and put it in an empty lab and observe it and say, okay, this is what storks do, right? That obviously would be distorted because you've taken it out of its habitat and you've taken it out of all the relationships with its world and the other things in its world. Well, it's the same thing with psychology for the ecological psychologists. They feel like you can't just take an isolated perceiver, completely, take them out of their world and hope to understand how a human being works, right? Or how we perceive or how we do things. So it's a shift to thinking about kind of complex perceptual systems, to think about systems. And there's a few kind of main ideas that come out of that. So one is that every organism, it's a human or an animal that's perceiving, has a body. And this is a kind of fundamental biological starting point. For this approach, you can't separate mind and body, right? These things are deeply interconnected. And the body as well is always in some kind of environment. It might be a natural environment, like we see on screen. It might be a constructed environment, like a classroom or a concert hall or a restaurant, and you're going to behave slightly differently in each of those situations, right? One idea here is that what you know, your knowledge, is not just all in your head, right? A lot of the knowledge that you have is co-constructed with the environment. There are things around you in your world, and by interacting with them, you can know things, you can do things, right? So it's not all just kind of inside to out. And another aspect of this then is that perception and action are kind of intertwined as well. So sometimes we perceive the world in order to act, right? Because we want to do something. So we kind of look around and we get the information we need in order to act. In other ways, though, we act to perceive. So one of James Gibson's main things in his work on vision is our eyes are never static. Our eyes are always moving, even if we're not conscious about it, right? And our head is moving, our kind of, this is constantly moving. And that's kind of how we can see, right? Is that we act to perceive. So there's, again, this back and forth, and so action and perception are really fundamentally connected here. And there's an interesting study that kind of relates to all of this, where they took participants and they showed them a hill, and they asked them to guess how tall it was and how steep it was. And so one group of people, they get them to look, they get them to make their guess. Another group of people, they do the same thing, but they put a heavy backpack on their back. And when you have a heavy backpack on your back, your guesses change. So, that group is going to look at the hill with the weight on their back and think, that's a pretty steep hill. That's a pretty tall hill. So your guesses kind of go with that, right? And are changed by your bodily situation, right? So this, again, it just brings out the kind of relationality of the relation between your body and the hill, right? And your perception of the distance or the height is related to its potential, how much work it's going to take you in terms of action, right? So these things are all connected. So Gibson has a nice metaphor. James Gibson, the two Gibsons were both made really important contributions in their own areas, and they worked together too. They were also married, but I'm going to have to try to keep clarifying. So James Gibson talks about this in terms of attunement. He says it's like a radio tuning into a frequency. You tune into the things in your world that are important for you, right? That are meaningful for you. And mostly what you tune into is what stays the same, what is invariant, and what things change. And that can be in when you're watching a scene, or it can be when you're listening, or any kind of senses, right? So an example from ecological acoustics is the sound of splashing. You can, when you hear a sound of a splash, you actually pick up a lot of information about the environment from that, right? Because that sound, like every sound, is made by physical things interacting in the world and creating vibrations. So if you think about it, when something drops into the water and makes a droplet sound or a splash sound, it creates a cavity in the water briefly, just temporarily. And that cavity has a certain resonance, a certain frequency. If it's larger, it's deeper. If it's smaller, it's higher. And so people can actually hear the size of an object dropped into water just from listening to the splash, right? They're attuned to this kind of just stuff in the world, not just to abstract sounds. They get something about the physicality out of the sound, which I think is really fascinating. Also, you can tell from the splash sound if it's a very thick liquid instead of water, that might change the sound as well. All right. These are some core ideas from ecological psychology, but probably the most influential idea is the idea of affordance. This has been taken up in many different fields, in cognitive science, also in design studies, work in human-computer interaction and computer science, architectural theory, and this is where we're going eventually, in musicology. And this is a concept that combines two of the things we've just been talking about: this interaction between the organism and the environment, and also the interaction between perception and action. So here's what James Gibson has to say. He says, the affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes, either for good or ill. The verb to afford is found in the dictionary. The noun affordance is not. I have made it up. And a lot of people have found this to be a very useful word. Basically, a thing's affordances are what you can do with it, right? So a chair is a very common example. I can sit in a chair, right? But that might be its most common use, but that's not its only affordance, right? I could also stand on the chair. I could use the chair as a music stand. I mean, I feel like I've done that many times, right? I could use the chair as a doorstop to keep a door open. The list of possibilities is kind of endless. I could kind of always come up with another use for the chair, right? But at the same time, it's not just anything goes, right? Like I can't eat the chair, right? There are other things that the chair doesn't afford these other kinds of things, right? So it's kind of constrained and open-ended at the same time, right? Endless possibilities within those constraints. But all of these affordances, again, rely on the organism, rely on your abilities, right? So I can sit in this chair, but like a newborn baby, my niece who's a couple months old, she can't sit in the chair, right? And other organisms might or might not, like a cat might be able to sit in the chair, but a whale cannot sit in the chair, right? This affordance is a relational concept again, right? It depends on some properties of the object combined with some abilities of the person or the organism. As James Gibson goes on to, after that passage I just read, he says that this idea implies the complementarity of the animal and the environment. And we're very good. There are other studies about like sittability, like optimal sitting height, where people are very good at judging whether a chair is kind of too high or too low for them to comfortably sit in it. And they're also pretty good at kind of adjusting chairs for somebody else, right? They see a tall person, they kind of put it at a certain proportion of their height. They see a shorter person, they kind of adjust it accordingly so that it's a comfortable thing. So this is, again, something we see about the chair. We see its affordances, not just its objective properties, much like the example with the hill. Now, the thing is with affordances is you have to learn that they're there. You have to see that they're there. And Don Norman, who's written very extensively on affordances and design, talks about this in terms of discoverability. You have to be able to discover that you can do a thing with it. And he's used this famous example, what are now called Norman doors that kind of trick you, where the handle is set up. This door on the screen has a pull handle, right? You see that handle affords pulling. It suggests this kind of a grab and pull. A push door will usually have a flat surface there that you push on, and you just kind of automatically know that without thinking about it. But as you can see from the word that had to be added on the top, this is a push door with a pull handle, right? And this is an example of what William Gaver calls a false affordance or a hidden affordance, right? This fakes you out. It makes you think that you can pull the door, but the door actually affords pushing, and you didn't know that. So Don Norman has this whole thing about that. If there's a door in your life that you persistently get wrong, it's probably not your fault. It's probably a badly designed door, right? It's probably giving off these false affordances or hiding its affordances, right? And he wants to design things that don't do that. Another aspect of this, though, is that while all of these doors and things seems like automatic that you perceive this, there is some element of learning here. And Eleanor Gibson was really a very important developmental psychologist. So she had a lot of insights about human learning and development. And she writes with her co-author Ann Pick, humans at least must learn to use affordances. We have emphasized that affordances reflect a fit between an environmental property and a possibility for action, but such a fit does not imply that the learning of affordances is necessarily simple or automatic. Some affordances may be easily learned, others may require much exploration, practice, and time. And one of the examples that they use here are chopsticks. I mean, in terms of a physical thing, they afford, picking up and lifting food or other small objects for, any human with certain kind of bodily abilities or certain kind of bodily structures. But at the same time, this is certainly not a universal skill, right? Because it's a highly cultural thing. It requires learning. And so again, there's another interaction here between nature and culture. And so that, something might have properties that could allow it to be used for something, but unless a culture kind of highlights those or focuses on those, they might be latent, right? And then, of course, this is kind of constant back and forth because, cultures are producing artifacts with certain goals, right? So there's kind of this back and forth there. Okay, so this is the idea of affordance in a nutshell. What does this mean for music? Does music have affordances? Well, certainly we often do things with music in the world, right? And so people like Eric Clark, who wrote a very interesting book on music and ecological psychology, he says, well, music affords dancing, it affords marching, right? It affords other kinds of synchronized activity, like certain kinds of work. It also may facilitate certain kinds of spiritual or religious or meditative experiences. And it facilitates certain kinds of communication, certain kinds of emotional communication. And some recent research is really suggesting that music and synchronization facilitate social bonding, that when a group makes music together, sings together, or dances together, or drums together, that there's a sense of social bonding that comes out of that. So we certainly do things with music. And so some, people like Clark and others have suggested that these are things, that music affords. These are some of music's affordances. Again, they rely on the properties of the music and the abilities of the people, right? You might have to know how to dance in order to participate in something like you're seeing on the screen, but also the music has to have certain properties to it, right? You're probably not going to do something with a lot of changing time signatures and rubato and these kinds of things. You want to kind of have a fit again between the music, the thing, and the people. There's also an idea that, musical objects themselves might have some affordances. So Robert Yerdingen writes about this a little bit. He says, if we admit sonic objects to the class of things permitting affordances, leading to truly musical affordances, then listening itself becomes a type of interaction with an aural environment. So the sound is kind of an environment, or the sound world is an environment. And then, things like chords or notes, right, might be objects that have certain affordances. I teach beginner, first year music theory. I'm teaching this right now. And I talk this way a lot, right? I say, oh, well, this chord, you can do this with, or you can do this with, right? Like, a dominant seventh affords resolving to a tonic and creating a cadence and creating a sense of musical closure, right? But it also affords deceptive resolution, which does another thing. A diminished seventh chord affords enharmonic reinterpretation. So it affords a certain kind of chromatic modulation, these kinds of things, right? Or a fugue subject might afford stretto or these kinds of things, right? So a lot of these ideas, can be applied to these sonic objects as well. But mostly what I've done in my work, which has used this idea of affordance quite extensively, is to come back to objects like the chair or, these, more kind of classic Gibsonian examples of hammers, chairs, knives, balls, these kinds of physical objects that we interact with. And to think about the affordances not of musical sounds, but of musical instruments as a kind of special object that we work with that's so intimate to so many musicians' lives. And this is kind of one of the main themes in my book. All of these ecological principles that I've been talking about apply here, right? So what an instrument affords depends on your abilities, right? You're a fit with your body, and it obviously requires a lot of learning and expertise. There are certain stable, invariant aspects to a musical instrument, and some of those are based in physics. For example, where I can get harmonics, right? Like that's just where they are because physics, right? It's not. But then other aspects of the regularity of the instrument are just cultural. I could tune this any number of different ways, but I normally tune it this way, and so that becomes a stable thing in my environment that I can rely on most of the time, right? From the ecological perspective, it doesn't really matter that some things are based in physics and some things are based in culture. Basically, what matters is that to me, they're pretty consistent, and I can pretty much rely on them when I'm doing what I want to do in the world. And I tune into these affordances. I tune into what I can do with the instrument. There's a study that I talk about all the time because it's a really clever experiment that shows this aspect of how an instrument's affordances have to be consistent. In this study, they did this with pianists, and they were looking at pianists' brains. So if you look, when they looked at the brains of expert pianists, this is with EEG, so we don't have to get into this stuff, but this is like electrodes on the scalp looking at the patterns of electrical activity from the brain. What they see is whether when pianists are either kind of moving their fingers like they're playing on a silent keyboard, or when they're listening to piano music, the motor parts of their brain that are involved with their hands and the auditory parts of their brain are working together. So even if you're just, playing the piano with the sound, you're playing an electric keyboard with the sound off, right? The auditory parts of your brain are there, primed, are working. And even when you're just listening to music for an instrument you play, the auditory, even though you're not moving, those motor parts of your brain are kind of primed. So in the expert pianists, they see a kind of link between the hand and the ear. That's a very, strong, practiced two-way connection. What they did in this experiment then is they got two groups of people who had never had a piano lesson in their life, and they gave them 10 weeks of practice, learning 5-finger melodies. And these beginners playing on a regular keyboard very quickly started to develop that hand-ear connection. Even by the end of the first 20-minute session, they started to see this. And by the end of the 10 weeks, it was looking very much like what you see in expert pianists. But they had a second group in the experiment. And this is why I love this so much. They had the exact same training, but the keyboard they were playing on randomly remapped where the notes were after every melody that they learned. They started from scratch in terms of the pitch mapping. Now, these people got very good at playing the melodies. They were actually very precise. I think they were more precise rhythmically than the other group. But the thing is because they never could associate a particular key with a particular pitch, they never developed this hand-ear connection, right? And so this shows how the stable affordances of an instrument are really important for creating this kind of physical sonic experience that playing an instrument is really kind of all about, in my view. Another relevant study that I also talk about a lot shows how this is kind of instrument specific. So they did this study with guitarists and then also with pianists after. And they come into the lab and they would be shown a chord on the screen and asked to just, kind of finger the chord shape as soon as they could, as fast as they could. And when they saw the prompt on screen, they would also hear a chord. Sometimes that chord they heard matched the chord they were supposed to play. And sometimes the mode was switched. So they would see A minor, but they would hear A major. So we can kind of do a mock-up of this. Right? So that's a kind of mismatch. We see A minor, we hear A major. Well, so the guitarists, when they did this, their performance was this is this blue bar here, was much slower when that distracting chord was with a guitar sound. If it was a piano, or if it was a piano, they were actually slightly faster. I don't know what that means, but they got messed up really only when it was on their own instrument. For flute or voice or organ or piano, didn't matter, didn't mess up their performance. When the keyboardists did it, they were messed up by the piano distractors and the organ distractors. So this suggests, particularly the organ result here, suggests it's not just about the timbre of their familiar instrument, that there's a sense that the pianists recognized on some level that this is a keyboard instrument, right? And so it interfered with their action that way. Again, this is kind of suggesting that affordances are really important to how we perceive, what we're doing and how we act, right? And again, this is the perception action loop I was talking about. You hear something, it affects how you act. So a lot of my music theoretical work has been, trying to think about instrumental interfaces in different ways, to think about what kind of a space do we have on a certain kind of instrument, right? On a piano, we kind of have one dimension. You can kind of go up and down, right? What's then interesting is like the intervention of certain notes, raised notes, black notes, right? And the asymmetry of that pattern. But I've done a lot with fretboard instruments of various kinds, and just try to kind of create a abstract theoretical model for fretboard space, right? The idea that we kind of have two dimensions here, right? We can go along the string, right? And we can go across the strings. And the idea that any spot on the instrument can be described in terms of those two things. So it's kind of a grid, right? So I have, like the second fret on the second string, right? And that's I can represent that kind of as a coordinate in this system. And then, what this lets me do, and here we have four strings like the ukulele, but we could have as many as we want, right? The structure of that two-dimensional space stays the same, whether it's this ukulele or a guitar or some other 10-string wacky thing, right? But what we can then do in this space is we can take shapes and we can move them around, right? And we can model this now theoretically. Obviously, this is, musicians have been doing this kind of thing for a long time. But the idea is that the physical shape is the thing driving the musical organization. It's not just, we imagine some sounds that we'd like to hear, and then we find a way to realize them. I mean, sometimes we do that, right? But other times it really feels like a passage is about shifting around a sound. This is just a very simple example from Stephen Merritt, an introduction he did to one of his songs where he takes this kind of standard shape and moves it around with the ringing open string. right? And that gives a really clear sense of a shape being shifted up with the open string staying the same and shifting back down again, right? This is the kind of, analysis I'm interested in. I'm not even really analyzing the notes. I'm just analyzing the shapes on the instrument and how they relate. And these shapes can then also be transformed and changed in various ways, right? So we can also take this standard shape and kind of flip it, right? And we can describe this in terms of a mathematical mapping again, right? Basically, the idea is here, there's a 4 in the label in the middle there, because when you do the shift, the pairs of frets kind of all add up to 4. So the second fret goes to the second fret. So 2 plus 2 is 4, right? The third fret goes to the first fret. So 1 plus 3. And they're just these kind of abstract properties when you start to change around the shapes like this that I find interesting and sometimes can help me dig into different musical examples. Another example of this kind of shifting technique, a more elaborate example of this kind of shifting technique, is from Jake Shimabukuro's arrangement of Leonard Cohen's song Hallelujah, where he basically kind of takes this shape up and up and up and up. So I'll just try to and then this is the same shape again with the open strings, of course. The finger shape is the same, right? So if we, again, represent this in this kind of music theory network, we see that except for that one chord in measure 75, this is just all the same shape being shifted up. And the beautiful thing here to me is that everyone, because the open strings stay in the same place, every chord is actually a different chord, right? It's the same, it's the same for our hands, but for our ears, there's like different colors for each one. And I think that's so fascinating and so interesting, right? I kind of like that doubleness of it, that it's the same and it's different all at the same time. Now, these examples bring up an interesting thing from this book by Raymond Tallis about the human hand. He says that we use our hands in kind of two ways. We have the hand that's kind of at the end of the arm, kind of like a paw, right? Like you're moving the hand with the arm, right? And that arm hand is one thing. And then we have figures that can do their own thing, that are independent and are not being moved by the arm. This kind of thing is clearly more the hand at the end of the arm. I set a shape, and then my movement is coming from my arm, from my left hand, but it's also coming from my arm with the right hand because I'm strumming, right? And so this is a particular use. For each of these things, we could switch it, right? Because we also do, we also have places where we use our left fingers very independently to do melodic patterns, and we use our right hand fingers independently to do finger picking. And of course, we can combine these things in all the possible ways. So we can hold a chord shape or do the shifting with finger picking or whatever, right? Or be doing melodic patterns with this hand while strumming with the other hand. They can be combined in any number of ways. And again, this just kind of comes down to the affordances, to our abilities, kind of what things we can do with our hands. Now, a lot of this, I'm already using the ukulele as an example here, but a lot of the things I've just been talking about are actually just more affordances of fretboard instruments, right? Strumming or playing these things. These are, you could do this on a guitar, you could do this on a mandolin, you could do a lot of these different types of things. You can finger pick or strum on a banjo, etc. And if you look at that abstract theoretical model that I use, it's kind of the same, right? No matter what type of instrument you're talking about, any four-stringed, fretted instrument, it could be an electric bass, it could be a mandolin, it could be a quattro, it could be an ukulele. But clearly these aren't the same, right? And this is important. So how is the ukulele different? What's specific to the ukulele. I mean, we're starting with just some kind of, this is where it feels obvious, but the size matters, right? The size makes a difference, right? As this picture illustrates, it's portable. It's a highly portable instrument. It's a light instrument. In terms of thinking about the body instrument fit, right? Thinking about this interplay between affordance and ability, it obviously affords playing by smaller hands, right? Or by smaller people. This is why my 10-year-old daughter is learning to play the ukulele right now in school, which is I'm really delighted by. But like, she couldn't learn how to play upright bass at this point. She's tiny, right? And so the small instrument affords that, even though it affords much larger people playing it too. I think one aspect of this, with this kind of example, the size and the scale of it means that to go that distance in pitch is a smaller jump. And there's psychology research that suggests these kinds of, like I said, arm-guided movements require a lot more regulation. You're a lot more likely to make a mistake when you're moving from your arm than you are from your fingers. And so I think that shorter scale of movement makes it a little easier to do these kind of big slides or big leaps, just psychological. Of course, people can do them on much longer fretboards, but I think it kind of affords that in a certain way. Another thing with the scale is just the number of frets you can reach is much, much larger. And I was really struck by this example from Giovanni Albini's arrangement of Philip Glass's Truman Sleeps. Just like how many frets are being spanned in this moment. It's really quite amazing. And this isn't just about the size, it's also about the tension on the strings, because I also play mandolin and it's quite small, but they're double strings and they're very heavy to push down. And so my strength is less when my hand is stretched out. And so there are things I can do on the ukulele that sound great that I just couldn't hold down all those strings on the mandolin to do it. So this isn't just about size, it's also about tension on the strings. And a fascinating thing in this arrangement, right, is that Giovanni's using kind of thumb technique, adapted from cello and upright bass performance. And I think that's also a really interesting example how we can take abilities that are associated with related instruments, other stringed instruments, and then import them and kind of borrow them, which I think is really, really interesting. If we go from the size and the body instrument fit to the tuning, and of course, tuning can vary. We often use alternate tunings, and so this is not a standard thing, but if we go with this kind of standard tuning, we can think about what this means for pitch and for tonal organization, right? There's a high register, right? There's no note lower than the middle C here, which might be considered a limitation by many people, although every instrument has a limited range. You can't really have an instrument that plays every note. I mean, I guess organ, some things are getting close, but then also I think it's interesting how this reentrant tuning has its own affordances and possibilities for action that are quite distinctive, right? So one of the things my daughter first recognized is that you can play the na 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 na, that you can play that tune that she likes with the open strings because it's a subset of a pentatonic scale. So a lot of pentatonic melodies you can kind of play a lot on just open strings. Of course, you can also use this open string set, imagine it as a chord, as a major chord with an added sixth. So like when I play Ain't She Sweet, which is a kind of old jazz number, Tim Panelli number, that features the sixth in the melody, it sits really well, right? Right, with that chord that's given to me by the tuning. We see this in various contexts. So we see the open strings used melodically for this kind of pentatonic melody in this piece by Ernest Ka'ai, which I only encountered thanks to Samantha Moore's most recent YouTube upload. So thank you for that, which is just a really beautiful, this is in the second measure, right? Where it's using the open strings to create this. And we get similar kinds of, cross string, using string crossings to play melodies in other things that you all certainly know, I'm sure, but this arrangement of the Carol of the Bells, right, is so fascinating, right? When I look at this melody without thinking of the ukulele, if I look at it as a violinist or something, right, I'm going to think of just doing this all on one string, right? To use my left hand fingers to change the notes and to keep my bow hand, my articulation all in the same place. So it's very efficient, right? But of course, here it's a totally different thing, right? Here we fix the left hand, and the finger movement that's creating the individual notes is the right hand instead. It's a complete flip. And of course, what that allows for it to ring, right, and imitate bells, right? So again, this is imitating the sonic affordances of another instrument, of the ringing bell, and getting that ringing bell song, ringing bell sound. John King gets this ringing bell sound in this piece, of course, and many of his other arrangements as well. This technique is really fascinating, and I think it's really just part of this reentrant tuning of having the outer strings a step apart. You can do these amazing things with that. Of course, this tuning also gives us chords that are unplayable on a lot of other fretted instruments. So I'm thinking, for example, this second chord in that excerpt I played before has that diatonic cluster, right? It's a very beautiful sound, and you can't, you could get it on a guitar with Nashville tuning, where some of the strings are tuned up an octave, but you can't get it in many other places. You need this kind of tuning to get that. And Jake Shimabukuro has said some very interesting things along these lines. I have the quotes queued up from a very interesting interview he did with Corey Wong on the podcast Wong Notes, but I'm not going to play them. I think I'm going to skip that just in the interest of time and continuing to move forward. But basically, he says a few interesting things about how, with this tuning, you can't just stay in one position and play a 2-octave run like you could on a standard tuned guitar, where you could just use the across string dimension to get all that range. Here, he says you kind of have to use the along string dimension. You kind of have to end up going up really high if you want to run that's that long, right? And the other thing he talks about really in an interesting way is the dynamic range of the instrument. He said he was in high school and he's playing trumpet, and he realized with the trumpet, he could play louder than he ever could with an acoustic ukulele. But then he also said he realized that with the ukulele, he could play quieter than he could ever play with the trumpet, until he could play so quiet you couldn't even almost hear it, or that you could hear the ridges of his fingerprints, on the strings, which I thought was very, very interesting. The dynamic affordances, right? Basically, we can apply this idea of affordance to any musical parameter we want, right? That you can play quieter, much quieter than many other instruments on the ukulele.
When you're doing longer runs. I remember when I
get that. And one kind of last area that I want to talk about here relates to work on acoustic cues for emotion. So people find music sounds happier when it is higher, when the rhythm is quicker, also when it doesn't have a rough tone, there isn't much kind of noisiness in the timbre. And the same thing happens for speech, right? So when people are happy, they talk faster, their voice goes a little higher, right? They're not sound like they're screaming, right? It's a kind of rounder tone. So all of those things in music and in speech communicate emotion through sound. And of course, the ukulele is kind of perfectly set up for this, but it's not the only instrument. Michael Strutz has done work on the xylophone, and he's talked about this line of, you can't play a sad song on the banjo. The idea that instruments that are higher pitched and don't have huge sustain, which requires more rhythmic activation, are particularly suited. They have affordances that really suit them well to happy, to creation of a happy mood. Now you have to be careful here. This isn't, we don't want to be deterministic and say like, oh, you can't play a sad song that's like ridiculous, right? You 100% can play sad and nostalgic and poignant and all of the moods, right? But I think it's also worth thinking about because it makes this connection between the instrument and the voice and emotion, right? And I think it does explain a little bit why there is this kind of joy associated with the ukulele. I think a lot of people feel this. I certainly have kind of always felt a certain joy associated with the instrument. And this also, the simplicity and these kind of size and all these things also then lead people to feel like that emotional expression is authentic in a particular way, which is summed up by these lyrics from Stephen Merritt's song, this little ukulele, which ends, an orchestra can tell you pretty stories, but this little ukulele tells the truth. And Emily Dolan has written about this and in the context of kind of indie pop aesthetics and nostalgia and emotion, these kinds of things. There's a sense that it's real because it's very kind of on a human scale, right? So this, theory of affordances is very, very general. It's not even just about human perception. But what I've tried to do here is to apply the theory and to use it to understand the ukulele or think about what we already do with the ukulele. But at the same time, I think there's again a back and forth because I think thinking about the ukulele can also expand and refine our theory of musical affordances. It shows how instruments are distinctive, even when you have the same basic interface like a fretboard, right? It's not just, that doesn't make it a small guitar or something. It's kind of its own thing in many different ways and for many different reasons. It has its own affordances. So the answer, what can you do? What can you do with an ukulele? Well, you can do a lot, obviously. You can play melodies and chords. You can do counterpoint. You can play classical music or jazz or traditional musics or contemporary music or pop or whatever. And this list is always open-ended because any list of affordances is open-ended. But also the answer to this question is you can do things with an ukulele that you can't do most of the time with other instruments. There's something that makes it special, right? And when its music kind of optimizes that and really goes into that essence of the instrument, I think that is when the music of the ukulele is also very special. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this terrific keynote speech. And thank you so much for providing us such a thoughtful introduction to many, many topics that I'm sure are going to pop out into the next presentation and also in tomorrow's presentation. I think your presentation really summed up very happily and in a beautiful way a lot of theoretical thoughts that really can give us a kind of a grid to go on exploring maybe more historical or site-specific repertoires or music for ukulele. So thank you so much from my side again for being here. I collected actually one question online, and I thank all the audience which is following the conference. You're so many. Thank you so much. So I'm going to address this question directly to you. So we have Mirek Tim Patek asking and saying the actual use of the affordances of the ukulele depends on the opportunity cost of not using the affordances of other instruments to achieve the desired effect. Is there any research on this topic apart from yours? I would.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very that's a very interesting question. And I don't know that there's really, I don't even think my work really addresses this. But it's such a fascinating thing to think about, right? Of why we choose one instrument rather than another, or why we design an instrument sometimes for when we have a particular goal in mind. There certainly are cases where I think to myself, I want this kind of musical effect, and then I pick an instrument accordingly. And it's certainly a trade-off, right? You kind of can't do both. At the same time, one thing that I think is very interesting that I have thought about a little more is places where you want the sound of that other instrument, but you still play it on your own instrument or on another, maybe you don't play that other instrument, right? And there's kind of like all of these examples, right? So I mentioned the bells in this talk, but there's so many other examples, right? Of when we hear horn calls on the piano or in a string quartet, right? Where we kind of get the sound of a horn and get the resonance and the kind of meaning of a horn call, right? Or a fanfare, right? But without any actual brass instruments, right? And we get these other kinds of translation, right? Like I've written about this fascinating solo piece by Eddie Van Halen, where he says he's trying to make his electric guitar sound like an organ, like a church organ. And he does this with volume swells so that you don't hear the percussive effect. You don't hear the percussive attack of the notes, but you just hear this kind of whoo, 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 right? So I think a lot of the time something very creative comes out of that trade-off, right? Where you can't get exactly what you want, but you kind of try to find another way. And actually what that's reveals is it usually reveals a hidden affordance, right? We didn't realize maybe that you could use the volume knob to create this kind of sonic effect until you wanted that organ sound on your electric guitar. And then you started messing around maybe, and you realize this is a technique that you can then practice and use. So I've gone to talking about the guitar, but I think this is a really great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do think the same. And I mean, having been a guitarist myself, I know, that my teachers always, remark the fact that the guitar should sound like a small orchestra,
right?
Like a miniature orchestra. So I totally feel what you're saying.
Yeah.
This symbolic kind of call that a sound
right.
and an explicit technique should have. Yeah. And I actually have a personal question about this. I absolutely love the fact that you don't talk about extended techniques, but rather about the extension of a technique or the borrowing or the adaptation. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this, because I find a very subtle blur between the extending techniques, which is maybe player specific, and then this kind of borrowing that becomes a kind of cultural thing. A community.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of this comes down to habit, right? What might be a normal, very everyday technique for one person might be an extended technique for another person, right? So it kind of, to me, that all comes down to kind of how comfortable you are in your abilities and your relation to the instrument in that way. But I've written a little bit about this, about altering instruments, altering tunings, and these kinds of things. Sometimes, the goal with the altered technique or extended technique is actually not to become comfortable with it, but the point is to put yourself off balance a little bit, right? Whether you're improvising or playing in a different way. So there are examples of this that I talk about from improvisers, but also in contemporary music. Sometimes the point is not to naturalize that way of relating to your instrument, but to be uncomfortable and to kind of be out of your element a little bit. And what I find interesting is a lot of the time what musicians say about that experience of doing extended techniques is it again points to this action perception link, right? Sometimes it's not about the sounds that they're able to get. It's about, they say they can hear things differently, when they're in an unfamiliar tuning, right? That they suddenly have to pay attention to the sounds because they don't know what's going to happen. And then they say, I hear the music fresh, it's like becoming a beginner again, right? And that's also interesting. With expertise, there's again a trade-off. Some things become easy, but you also lose some of the surprise, which is delightful when you're just learning a new instrument as well. And so extended techniques, or you can change your technique, or you can change the object, right? Again, you can change the affordances, or you can change your skill. But either of those things can kind of make things new, and that can be a really exciting thing as well.
Fantastic. I have another question from our audience that I think it perfectly links with what you were saying. We have this person KP Tam, which is asking and say, we can talk about affordance of the ukulele as a generic category, or say generic instrument, but I suppose we can also talk about affordance of an individual ukulele and how it differs from that of another individual ukulele because of the difference of the size, the bill says wood used, the string used, and so on.
Yes, absolutely. 100%. That's such a great comment. I love that. Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. Right. With all of this, we can talk about, we can be even more specific, right? That an individual instrument may have something about it, right? Not even just, oh, it's a tenor, whatever, right? There might be something about one specific instrument that it kind of has a certain tone in one place, or a certain feel, or whatever. And it has its own specific affordances. And the same thing on the player side, right? There are certain people who can do things on the instrument that they have abilities that seem to be totally individual, right? And then magical things can happen there. So this is a really wonderful question, of where is the line between a kind of a general instrumental idiom, right? And then the idiom of a particular musician, right? That a particular instrument that has its own kind of stamp, its own kind of voice, that you can hear it and you go, oh, must be this particular person, or this particular instrument that I can hear. So yeah, wonderful comment.
Thank you so much. So now I'm asking to our Zoom room if there's any question from our speakers, and if not, I think we can go on.
Perhaps just one, very personal. Jonathan, I don't know how long have you been playing the ukulele? We had just a quick chat about that. But, your story with the instrument could be very interesting for us.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, I don't know how interesting I am, but it's interesting to me because it's my life. But so my story with the ukulele is that my dad is a guitarist. And so I grew up in a house full of guitars. And when I was probably 4 years old or something, I was given an ukulele for Christmas or something. Because it was small and I could hold it and I could be like my dad, And so I wasn't really playing it. There are family photos with me and, family videos where I'm just like strumming away and making up songs with my sister, really hilarious, personal things. But like, that is the instrument of my life. I couldn't play any chords or things, but I loved the feel of it. I loved playing with this, of course, like super out of tune and everything. And then once I grew older, once I learned to play the guitar, probably as a kind of a preteen, I'm mostly started out as a violinist. So I was playing stringed instruments from when I was 3, playing violin. So probably when I was a preteen, then I learned to play guitar. And then, a little while later, the light bulb went off of like, oh, I can use these shapes on the ukulele. And then, then I started to fool around with the ukulele as well. Probably the time I played the ukulele most in my life was when my daughter was a baby, because we had one in her playroom and I would just, hanging out with the baby, you got lots of time on your hands. And I played the ukulele to her like all the time and sang to her. When my wife and I we were living in Chicago, but we're from here in Canada, and we'd have these long drives back and forth. And when our daughter was a baby, one of us would sit in the back seat with the ukulele, and because the car seat's facing backward, and so you can face the baby. And we didn't know that there were like CDs you could just put on a CD, but whatever. I mean, my wife and I are both musicians. This is actually, full disclosure, this is my wife's ukulele, which I got her to. She's a music teacher, and I said, please, can I borrow your instrument for today? So we have a house full of ukulele players here.
Amazing, Jonathan, and thank you so much for, giving us this musical example live. I really appreciate this, and I think it's a beautiful thing also for musicologists. To carry the instrument inside the conference. It's something that I absolutely love, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right, so if we don't have any more questions, let me say, Jonathan, thank you so much again for this terrific presentation. And please stay with us during the rest of the day. And so let's go on with the next presentation. Okay, our next presenter is Fabrizio Nastari. Fabrizio is a composer whose aesthetic is primarily based on the use of ironical devices and musical quotations. He's active both as a researcher and as well as a composer. He is pursuing a PhD in artistic research at the Estonian Academy of Music and Theatre in Tallinn, investigating in particular the use of rhetorical devices in the compositional practice. Since 2019, he is a production assistant at the High Score Festival in Pavia. He's highly engaged in contemporary music, both as a composer but also as a professionist in culture and education. So he's presenting today a talk entitled "Inside the Ukulele: Approaches and Solutions in Classical Contemporary Composition." So I leave Fabrizio the floor, but before, I have some technical information for our audience. Even if you join us before, or if you're joining us now, please remember that you can always comment during the presentation. You can leave your questions and we will address them at the end of the talk. I also know that Fabrizio has some video to share to you. So in order to keep the highest technical level in the reproduction of the video, we will stream the video not from the Zoom session, but directly on the YouTube session. Thank you so much for the patience, and I take the opportunity to say thank you to our technician Stefano Colombo, which is behind in the back office of this conference, for operating all this. So thank you so much, and please, Fabrizio, I leave you the floor.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Giovanni, and thank you, Stefano. I share the screen. Yeah. So hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. First international conference about the ukulele. And I will give you an overview of what is happening in the ukulele world. And then I will point out some aspects that need attention, in my opinion. And I will address composer's perspective, ukulelist perspective. And I will focus on the contemporary classical music world mainly. Let me say that I decided to take into consideration the European context mainly, because it's the one I know the most, and because the activities around the ukulele in Europe are growing day by day. There are new books, courses, master classes, new students, new doctoral students also doing interesting research. So yes, I am a composer. I composed 3 pieces for ukulele and 1 for duo is still in process. So I cannot say I know everything about ukulele, but there are musicians that surely have more experience than me. And so I decided to contact some ukulelists and composers that helped me in understanding where the ukulele is going. I will sometimes step out from the ukulele world. Maybe it can make you mix up some of your thoughts, nurture your creativity, I hope. So I will be outside the comfort zone sometime. And this can help starting further or different reflections. So I would like to, at the beginning, to show you this list. Is a very short list, so I am sorry if I forgot someone, but it just gives an idea of how many people around the world is involved in writing for ukulele. A piece by Samantha Muir. So whenever you want, we can play the video.
Okay, so Fabrizio, we set up the video. While we do that, I ask you maybe to stop your screen sharing and to redo it, because I think that there are some technical issues. We see the slide, but after a while it disappears and we get a gray. Okay. So, okay, now we will stream the video, and I will give you. I will wave at you when it's done. Okay. Okay, Fabrizio, the video is over. So maybe just a quick suggestion, if you could show us once again the list.
Yeah.
Maybe someone has missed it because there's this technical trouble. Okay, please go on.
Yeah, this is the list. Yeah, sorry to interrupt the video there. I really suggest you to go to listen to it, of course. But this ukulele, as you see in the video, has 5 strings, and I like to show you the description of that Samantha wrote. Yeah. So you see 5-string tenor ukulele. The fourth course comprises both low G and high G strings. The piece could be played on high G or low G. Staff notation can be ambiguous, and I like to tune my ukulele down half step sometime. So you see, we are already in the core of the discussion, I think. Number of strings, tuning, ability to rearrange the piece in another way, or ambiguous notation. So I think is a very good starting point for many issues around the ukulele. We have already mentioned all of them probably, and there are big questions. What is a ukulele? How many identities the ukulele has? Where is the ukulele now? Where is it going? And it's really fascinating. First of all, I want to say that I notice a way of talking about the ukulele in general that is free, in the sense that no one feels pressure from academic world, or no one feels competition with the other more historical instruments, as it can be the violin, for instance. About the guitar, we will talk later. There is, of course, a relation between ukulele and guitar, but let's keep it aside now. So yeah, ukulele is free, we can say, is very popular, and there are people that play ukulele as a profession. But we have musicians at every level that play ukulele, and this helps to maintain the freedom of ukulele, I think. But why is that? Of course, it is a cheap instrument if we compare it with other instruments. If you want a very beautiful instrument, of course, it's not cheap, but still not very expensive. And we can carry our ukulele or many ukuleles with us. There are different sizes, so also opportunities, but I think there is a deeper motivation why ukulele is popular. And one of them, I think, is that ukulele has a real strong character, has a really distinguished sound and timbre. Even with a very, very cheap instrument, we already recognize the sound of the ukulele. And evidently, it is a sound that most of the people appreciate. And it is this sound that we composers or ukulelists, we want to take care of. And all the ukulelists and composers I had the pleasure to talk with can confirm this, I think, that the typical timbre of the ukulele is what is attractive and what drives our interest toward the ukulele. It is at least one of the instinctive attraction toward the ukulele. And when composing and when playing, we want to develop or to fix, to take care of the ukulele timbre. And I like to quote Donald Bousted, that told me in a conversation we had that writing for ukulele is a celebration of sound. And I think it is a really beautiful image, and good composers have the ukulele sound in mind while composing. I think it is true, and it is a really good statement to keep in mind when we think the ukulele and when we approach the composing for ukulele. But even though everyone can recognize the sound and the timbre of the ukulele, it is also true that every instrument can have a wide range of differences in sound, even between the same size. This is why all the musicians I talk to have many ukuleles, and they look for the right timbre. And this is part of the interpretation work, I think. We want to have the right instrument for the right piece. And if we change instrument, we are changing already the interpretation a bit. This is a very peculiar aspect of this instrument. It is maybe also a privilege, or it can be a responsibility. I think, first of all, it is a challenge, and musicians need challenges, and composers too. So if we turn the table for a moment, maybe composers can start thinking to a certain kind of ukulele before really composing. And for this, we need also musicians that have experience, have many ukuleles, and know very, very well each instrument. So they can show to a composer the peculiarity of that instrument. It can be part of the composition process if we start before the composition process, like the writing process. Of course, it depends on the composer too, what is his interest. So maybe not always we can have this relation, but it can be an opportunity, I think. And also, I think this already happened when a composer chooses one size instead of another. It is already a declaration of intent. The timbrical aspect can be part of the game. And so I think that if we share this game of choosing the instrument between composer and ukulelist, it can be really interesting, I think. Probably also the ukulelists that are also composers, they do already this, and they know that when they choose an instrument, also when they choose a different tuning, they are changing their approach of what they are going to play or they are going to improvise. Also, I think it's perfect after the speech of Professor de Souza now. But I think composers need to be escorted sometime and guided in this direction. And they need to touch and play a bit also maybe the instrument. And here I think we can make a connection to another aspect that I think is really important and delicate. That is that the ukulele has not yet a very powerful identity. It has a distinctive identity, but not powerful. And it does not come from centuries and centuries of music, and it does not have an entire cultural world behind it. Probably its identity is in between different cultures, and the distinctive identity, not powerful, is an opportunity, I think, and it can be also a responsibility because we can help defining the identity of the ukulele. I'm not saying that we are the only one who can do that, of course, and I believe probably the history will determine its identity. But maybe its identity is exactly in between. So we do not have to build anything, but only underline this character, this multicultural nature. And what we can do is anyway to open new perspectives. We can develop some features, underline some features that we help, and so we help to define the ukulele and what can be its role. My personal hope is that while defining or trying to define the identity of the ukulele, we don't refuse its popular nature, because I think it's part of its identity. And the academic world and approach can surely help in the identity building, but the popular life of the ukulele is part of its identity, I believe. And all the musicians also I talked to say that they don't feel any problem with playing and sharing the instrument with folk musicians, popular musicians, and people outside the academy. So I think there is this relation now between the celebration of sound and what is the identity of a ukulele. Here we can try to engage also another big question, and how the ukulele can reinforce its presence in the musical world. I think also, again, I like to remember that I'm not reporting only my opinion. So after my talking with some musicians, I think that it seems that the most important action to do now is to write for ukulele in ensemble. And chamber music with ukulele means thinking the ukulele in a different way. And for composers, perspective means opportunities. And so the ukulelist also has maybe to stay out of the comfort zone sometime in a chamber music. And this can really help, I think, in building some features, not new, but different features for ukulele. Or this can help us in understanding the identity of the ukulele. So what's the role of ukulele in chamber music? I think it requires a careful work from composer's perspective. We can have the ukulele as a soloist, of course, but I think it will be even more important and difficult also to write music where the ukulele is perfectly part of the ensemble, and we need to find a characteristic for which we need the ukulele in that chamber environment. But then we have, for instance, the volume as a problem. The ukulele has a short attack and it is not very high in volume unless we play strumming technique, for instance. But I say it is not a problem. As I said before, we have also other instruments in chamber music that are not so strong. We have harpsichord in chamber music, guitar, of course, mandolin, but also the cymbalon or the koto from Japan, for instance, the Estonian kannel, and the recorder. I mean, the recorder is not powerful, but it has a really distinguished sound. And so what we see as a limit sometimes is just a characteristic, and we need to underline that maybe. Someone told me that it is difficult to remove the ukulele from its melodic role sometimes. Somehow many musicians approach the ukulele mostly as a melodic instrument when there are other instruments involved, maybe because of its short attack. But for instance, someone has approached the ukulele in chamber music context as a toy. This is interesting, I think, and in part this can suggest us also that many people see the ukulele as a toy. I mean that one of the inner character that people see in a ukulele is the happiness of the ukulele or the joyful aspect. This is an open topic and requires probably another research, but I like to bring this image to you, and maybe it can be discussed in another occasion. What people see in a ukulele, what we see in a ukulele, it can be really fascinating. But to stay in the chamber music issue, I have an example, so we can play the second video now.
Okay, Fabrizio, thank you. You can go on.
Yeah, so we were here, and where chamber music, I think it's part of the identity building. And of course, this is an example with unusual instruments. Let me say also that this video was like not all the piece, it was just some part of the piece. So yeah, unusual instruments, but still I think it shows a very smart way of approaching chamber music with ukulele also. And I think it can suggest to us some sounds and timbrical ideas maybe that we can work on. And I choose this one because it brings us outside the ukulele world for a moment. So ukulele was not a soloist. It is part of the chamber, and it is important to force sometimes us outside. And another approach that shows another completely different world of sounds is, for instance, given by who decided to try to apply the Arvo part composition technique to ukulele. And it sounds really well, I think. For instance, Joan Galvez is trying this approach, but also other composers. And Giovanni and Samantha, for instance, have also written an article about arrangement of Arvo part music for ukulele. And it is funny that the technique by Arvo part is tintinnamboli, like little bells, and one of the most effective technique on ukulele is the campanella technique, so little bell everywhere. Here is the title of the paper, if you are interested. And so, yeah, I think we can already listen maybe also the third video, where is a piece by Joan Galvez with Arvo part technique applied to ukulele. It's an original composition, not arrangement.
Okay, we go on with the third video. Okay, Fabrizio, we are here. Before going on, would you just please repeat the title of the piece? Because someone was asking in the chat.
The one before.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's the Symphonies for Toys, and it's by Fabian Svensson. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. Cool. So please.
Yes. Yeah. So well, going further means not only on compositional side, and as some musicians have suggested, we can work. Well, you ukulelist more than me, but we can work together with some instrument maker or luthier. We can develop instruments and we can find different solutions. I talk about material, so wood and this kind of technical aspects that can bring the ukulele to be more present also in a chamber music environment. So I'm talking about the volume, for instance, but also timbrical aspects. We have the possibility to work on the ukulele also from this perspective, because when I was talking about a strong identity but not powerful, I was also implying this. And we can still work on the product, I mean, on the object of the ukulele, what we can develop, what can we ask from this instrument. Many instruments has changed throughout history. Violins, harpsichord, piano, and guitar. I think most of us know how much the guitar is changed. So we should not have any fear or trying new ways of making ukulele, for instance. And I'd like to show you two pictures again outside ukulele world. One is Paolo Angeli on the left. He's an Italian guitarist that plays folk guitar from Sardinia, but he applies some modifications to the instrument and uses electronics. And so maybe, I don't know, it can give us some ideas. And also on the right, we have Alessandro Santa Caterina with another folk instrument from Calabria. And this time he tries to play, for instance, in a different way with a vent in the right hand. And there are videos on YouTube. So if you are interested, of course, you can go and listen. And we already have examples with ukulele and electronics, and also ukulele played, for instance, with bottleneck. But we know also from Professor De Souza how the affordances change our approach, how we play. But also I collected from musicians in general that freedom in approaching is not a problem. They are really open to try everything. So I think we should push in this direction too, to see what can come. Well, at the same time, I also collected that the most appreciated ukulele playing technique is the campanella technique, so very classical, let's say. But a little step back, let's start from this question. Is the ukulele a small guitar, or is there any piece for ukulele that cannot be played on the guitar? So first, let me clarify that it's not a race. And most of you probably know that, yeah, that this in the picture is not the actual size of the ukulele. It's not a race, and we need to remember this. It is just that the instruments have similarities, and most of the people who plays ukulele plays guitar, so we don't need this kind of ukulele probably. But also most of the people that plays mandolin or the theorbo comes from guitar, so it is just a practical comparison for me. And I noticed some different ideas. Someone approaches the ukulele as a small guitar, and they just apply the guitar technique to the ukulele, so to a small guitar. What I think we need to focus on for this discussion is the playing technique. Let's start from the instrument itself. Ukulele has the reentrant tuning and is one of its peculiar aspects. We can choose not to have it, but when we have the reentrant tuning, of course, we open some very interesting possibilities. And the campanella technique is, in this case, is very efficient in my opinion. And it is also very interesting to compose using this kind of tuning. And we can have something that, yes, it can be arranged for guitar, but still the campanella, I think, finds a very convincing sound on the ukulele. But also the easiness in changing tuning on ukulele creates great possibility. There are already examples, and also the strumming on the ukulele is powerful and very different from other instruments. 4 strings allows us to play all the 4 or some of them, and while strumming, I mean. And again, the reentrant tuning also give us possibilities in rasgueado or tremolo that we cannot have on other instruments. So we have also a small fingerboard, and even with bigger ukulele, it is small compared to guitar. And so I have the same picture of Giovanni that also Professor De Souza showed, because I think this technique sounds very clean anyway, and it's not like impossible to do it. It just requires a professional to do it. So starting from this image, we can see that the left hand also is somehow different from guitar and has more freedom somehow. I don't want to go into details because I know there are presentations that probably will give a better description of these aspects. The point for me is to look at those features all together that give us the unicity of the ukulele. So I think that in order to have a different path from the guitar, because some musicians told me that they are afraid of following the path of the guitar, we need to be from the very beginning very open to composers that doesn't know the ukulele very well and very open to try. And I think I already saw this really free approach on both sides. So in conclusion, I think the identity of ukulele is still to be defined, and this gives us freedom to explore in every direction on the instrument itself, but also with or through the instrument, through music. And I think the freedom ukulelists have in approaching the tuning, for instance, is very interesting for composers, I think. And we can go also toward microtonalities. There are also some examples. With the campanella technique, every tuning and every instrument give us many new options every time. And I like to end the presentation with the concept of celebration of sound that Donald Bosted gave me, because I think is a very beautiful concept to keep in mind when we think of ukulele. And I would like also to close the presentation with a piece by Donald Bosted for ukulele and another instrument that requires a very solid playing technique. So it is for professional and with some unique ukulele sound and very elegant composition writing, I think. So thank you, and we can listen to the last piece also.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio. And now, I mean, to keep everything in time with our schedule, I suggest to put the video into the YouTube streaming, so the audience will see a thumbnail appearing when we will be editing the video. So I think that maybe we can leave some comments or some space for comments about this video also for today, so we can keep our time. So thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you to you.
All right. So I have actually some questions for you, but in order to keep everything, our schedule working properly, maybe I'm going to address you one question, and then there's another one that we can leave for tomorrow and for the round table, because I think it's very intense, and I think it's worth giving it the right space. So we have again Mirek Timpatek saying the identity of some instrument can be built within centuries, but then it can be shifted in decades. look at the mandolin, its perception is no longer Vivaldi, but acoustic music. And this shift happened thanks to the bluegrass genre in the second half of the 20th century. Do you expect such a shift yet in the ukulele world?
It's really difficult to answer. Well, probably he already is thinking of doing the shift because he's asking about the shifting. But yes, of course it is possible. It's really difficult to know the answer now, but we will see. What I see is that ukulele is played all over the world in every genre, every musicians. So it is really difficult to understand what path can have the ukulele and music for ukulele also, yeah.
Thank you. But I think that you touched a very important point. So it's also the interaction between composer, the idea of an ongoing dialogical approach where you don't only compose like a blindfolded person who wants to achieve a goal or address a specific kind of music, but I found very, very interesting this kind of dialogue between you and other composers, which I find extremely important, and I'm sure that in the round table it would be an important theme. There's another enormous topic, which is the problem of identity, and I kept note of the interesting question that popped out in our YouTube streaming. So I'm going to keep them for today, and I'm going to thank you very much once more for this wonderful presentation.
Thank
All
you.
right. So I think, we can move on with our next and third presenter for today, which is Samantha Muir. Samantha Muir studied classical guitar at the Royal College of Music in London. And since 2012, she has dedicated herself to promoting and furthering classical ukulele. And she is currently doing a PhD at the University of Surrey, focusing on creating new works for classical ukulele. Her arrangements and composition are published by Les Productions d'Oz et Shot. Recently, her work was featured in Ukulele magazine and on the BBC radio program, The Forum. Samantha's research interests include the history of the ukulele, and she's also a member of the Consortium for Guitar Research at Sydney Sussex College, the University of Cambridge. So today we have Samantha. We are presenting a paper entitled "The Search for Classical Ukulele." Welcome, Samantha, and I leave you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to say a really big thank you to both Giovannis for making this event possible, and I'm really honored to be a part of it. So thank you. Can I share my screen?
Of course you can.
Yeah, okay.
Meanwhile, I remember the audience, if you have comments or questions, just drop them into our YouTube streaming video and enjoy the presentation. Please, Samantha.
Thank you very much. I bought my first ukulele in 2012, and up until that moment, I had, like many people, always thought of the ukulele as a toy or a novelty rather than a serious instrument. And I'd always associated it with either George Formby or Tiny Tim, neither of whom appealed to a serious classical guitarist such as myself. But as I now realize and admit, this is a very narrow point of view, although unfortunately one that is still held by many, and it's often aided and abetted by the mainstream media, which we've seen here in the UK just this week. What attracted me to the ukulele was its beautiful harp-like tone, and what has kept me enthralled are its limitless possibilities. My first ukulele books were the Baroque ukulele by Tony Mizzen and the classical ukulele by John King, both of which were published by Flea Market Music. These were the books that really opened my eyes and my mind to the potential of the ukulele. As a classical guitarist, the idea of classical ukulele has always really resonated with me, to such an extent that I started a PhD at the University of Surrey on classical ukulele. So today I'd like to reflect on what classical ukulele means, particularly in the broader context of the ukulele. Because by putting the word classical in front of ukulele, we imply something different. And since this term has grown in prominence since the publication of the classical ukulele in 2004, it's often regarded as a new approach to playing the ukulele. I would argue, however, that while the term classical ukulele might be relatively new, the approach isn't. And I really don't think that John King regarded it as new either, as we'll see. So this begs the question, why did he use the term and what was he hoping to achieve by it? In order to determine that, we need to consider the following. What are the characteristics of classical ukulele, and how does the classical ukulele approach, if there is one, differ from other approaches? I'd also like to consider the historical influence of related instruments, including the machete of Madeira, the Baroque guitar, and the Renaissance guitar. So the classical ukulele was published as part of Jumping Jim's Ukulele Masters series, and other books in this series include books by Herb Otter and Lyle Ritz, and then more recently James Hill. These books are all instrumental, and the other books are jazz, popular music, and traditional songs as well. And they would use what we would generally call the chord melody approach. Now, in the classical ukulele, the foreword by Jim Beeloff says that while ukulele players have often included one piece of classical music as a novelty and to demonstrate the diversity of the instrument, the classical ukulele was a first of its kind book in that it brought together a collection of pieces by Bach, Chopin, Mozart, Beethoven, as well as traditional tunes. He also made a point of saying why it was so important to include not only notation, but easy to read tablature in order to make this book widely accessible to ukulele players of all musical backgrounds. A feature of John King's arrangements, as we've already heard, was his use of the Baroque technique of campanella style, where the notes are placed across the strings to create overringing effects reminiscent of little bells. And of course, this is very typical of the high G or re-entrant tuning. So if we look at the table of contents of King's book, we can see that we've got traditional tunes from Ireland, England, Japan, chopsticks, a prelude by Chopin, a Hawaiian tune by David Kalakaua, the last king of Hawaii, another Hawaiian tune, a piece by Mozart, Bach, another Hawaiian tune, an Italian dance, more pieces by Bach, a piece by Lully, Beethoven, Bach again. This is probably the most interesting and unexpected piece, La Carolina, by Ricardo Porfirio de Fonseca, a Madeiran composer who wrote this piece in the 1830s. And then, of course, a piece by Couperin, a Baroque piece, and finally a jazz standard by Scott Joplin, The Entertainer. So we have a very diverse and eclectic mix of music, which begs the question, why did he call it the classical ukulele when many of the pieces are not classical? So to summarize King's approach, he was very much influenced by his classical guitar background. In his foreword, he noted the importance of a round, clear tone as being central to the classical aesthetic. But I'd add to that if you listen to someone like Jake Shimabukuro playing Bohemian Rhapsody, he also has a very beautiful, round, clear tone, although he's not promoting himself as a classical ukulele player, but there's something very classical in his approach. King also adopted the Pima finger-picking system, which is used by classical guitarists, so using the thumb, index, middle, and to some extent the ring fingers. He indicated strums as rasgueados, a flamenco technique, and one which has been frequently used by classical guitarists. All of the pieces in his book were arrangements, but he did show a great historical awareness in his use not only of campanella style, but in his knowledge of the machete of Madeira, one of the forerunners of the ukulele. And in his notes, King wrote, "With the recent discovery and publication of a manuscript of duets for machete and guitar, the argument against the validity of performing classical music on the little four-string instrument has been rendered moot." And he was referring to the publication in 2003 of the collection of pieces composed for the Madeiran machete by Candido Drummond de Vasconcelos. The original manuscript was dated 1846. Now, as I'm sure you know, the machete is one of the forerunners of the ukulele. Now, the interesting thing about the Drummond manuscript is that the majority of pieces are in the form of European ballroom dances, waltzes, polkas, marches, and quadrilles. Robert White, writing in 1850, described this as the fashionable music of our ballrooms. The fashionable music. In other words, Drummond was composing contemporary music for the machete. He wasn't creating historic repertoire. He was catering for modern tastes. If you like, he was writing pop music of the time. King, on the other hand, was borrowing repertoire from instruments such as the piano, the harpsichord, and the cello in order to create historical and traditional repertoire for the ukulele. And in so doing, he added depth to the repertoire, but he was creating a classical repertoire retrospectively. And here we can draw a parallel again with the classical guitar, because this is what was happening at the beginning of the 20th century. Take, for example, Tariga. He was arranging Chopin for the guitar, and then Segovia was arranging Bach. And I wonder if the classical ukulele approach is why so many classical guitarists are attracted to it, because of this parallel. And so then the elephant in the room is the question of whether classical ukulele is a sideshow to the classical guitar. Are we just using the ukulele as a small guitar, and in so doing demeaning both instruments? And these are hard questions, but ones, I think, which need to be addressed. And in order to do that, we need to look at the term classical guitar. It was first used in the early 20th century by guitarists such as Segovia, who wanted to elevate the guitar from its folkloric traditions to a serious concert instrument. And the term classical guitar was gradually used to replace the term the Spanish guitar. One of the first uses of the term was by Vada Olcott Bickford, and in 1921 she published her Method for the Classic Guitar. Bickford was one of the most prominent members of the banjo, mandolin, and guitar movement in America. In fact, Jeffrey Noonan, in his book The Guitar in America, identified Vada Olcott Bickford and William Foden as two of the most important guitarists in America in the first half of the 20th century. She was a performer, a composer, a teacher, and a columnist for both the Cadenza and the Crescendo magazines. And I think it's really important to realize that at this time, it was usual for guitarists to also play the banjo and the mandolin, and many of these players also adopted the ukulele as a kindred instrument. Now, the previous year, Bickford had published an extensive method for the ukulele with her husband, Czar. They used D6 tuning and only used notation, which they considered the proper way of writing for an instrument. They weren't great fans of tab. Now, her foreword talks about extending the scope and the literature of the ukulele. The aim of the method being to present all the various styles of playing. This included the ordinary stroke used by the Hawaiians, and also the guitar or picking style, the use of the plectrum and the felt pick as well. An advert in the Crescendo magazine in 1920 gave no less than 18 reasons why the Bickford method was superior to all the others. And one of the most important points was the guitar or fingerstyle of playing is thoroughly explained, a feature almost entirely lacking in existing methods. And we can see here in her piece, Cupid's Pranks, which again, it's another European dance, a mazurka. It's a very classical looking piece. The cross represents the thumb, and then this is the index finger of the right hand and the middle finger. And we see the chord here plucked with the thumb, the index and the middle finger, whereas down here, she's got some indications that these chords should be strummed. Now, one of the features of her method was that although she used re-entrant tuning, the notation used the low A. So this creates a more musically correct looking score, but there's no getting away from the fact that once you play this chord, this A is actually sounding an octave higher. And you can see that this is very much one of the idiosyncrasies of the ukulele, where you have problems notating for it because of the voicing, and things are changed both orally and visually if you have an A here. Now we can also see how John King had this tremendous understanding of the history and the literature of the ukulele, because he included one of Bickford's arrangements in his book, Famous Solos and Duets, Timothy at the Husking Bee. And again, you can see the ukulele 1 is playing the melodic line. There are a few chords here, and the ukulele 2 is being used as a strummed accompaniment. So her approach was very much to include both what she called the strokes and fingerstyle techniques. Now, if we go back to Ernest Kai, the man attributed with writing the first ukulele method in 1906, was revised in 1910. The ukulele, a Hawaiian guitar, and how to play it. And then in 1916, he brought out a second, more comprehensive method, the ukulele and how it is played. He used C6 tuning, the original tuning from the Taro Patch or the Madeira and Rajau. He also included the strokes, the strumming techniques, and fingerstyle as well. He included arrangements as well as original compositions. Now, the Ukulele Hall of Fame describes Kai as the first Hawaiian virtuoso. He made appearances all over the world. He was an arranger, a composer, a teacher, a publisher. He also had a ukulele manufacturing company. He played the guitar as well and the Taro Patch as well. Now, this is his Spanish Fandango, and another dance, from the 1910 revised edition. He had quite a unique method for writing the tab. The circles are the open strings, and then the filled-in circles are the stopped notes, and he wrote the fret number above. I just tabbed it out here so you could see it more clearly. But interestingly, he retuned the first string down to G. And if you look at this, you can see, again, it's a very, what I would call a very classically influenced piece. And I would play this with my thumb and ring finger, and then an index and middle finger. And I'd have a very nice little arpeggio pattern with the melody on the top line. And it would be very much like many of the classical guitar pieces I play. Now, once again, John King included arrangements and pieces by Ernest Kai in his famous solos and duets. And there was a very interesting discussion actually a couple of days ago on Facebook about the title and why there was an R in here and an L here. There's no R in the Hawaiian alphabet. And as Jim pointed out, and also Kathy Dunsford, if she's listening, this is most likely a Maori word that means the same thing, to go. And Kai spent some time touring in New Zealand, and it's very interesting the similarities between the Hawaiian language and the Maori language. So if we'll just have a little listen to some of this. And as you can see, well, Jonathan already mentioned this, it's almost campanella in its effect. You can hear the over-ringing, and then we have the chords. So let's just have a little listen. I'll move on because we're running short on time. You can hear that on YouTube. I'd like to look now at Jenny Durkee, who again was a very early exponent of the ukulele, and I think her approach was very unique. Her 1920 book was a compendium of her method and also her book of solos. Now, she invented the felt pick and played with the tremolo effect. Once again, D6 tuning like the Bickfords, but unlike the Bickfords, she also included tab. Her work also included arrangements and originals, and we can see here how she used the felt pick, the down-up strokes for the melody, and then when you have a chord and the minim, there are 8 strums, down-up strums, to create very fast tremolo effect, and this would just be 1 strum. So you can see this is a very effective way of playing the ukulele. I found this concert program in the Crescendo from April 1920, and you can see here it's a ukulele recital featuring Jenny Durkee on the ukulele, and then a harpist, a mezzo-soprano, and accompanist, presumably a pianist. And if we look at the actual repertoire, it begins with a popular song. This was a popular song in World War I, and ends with more popular songs on the ukulele and harp. But it's also a very classical program, because here we have Miserere from Il Trovatore by Verdi, played as a ukulele solo, and then an Italian melody for harp and ukulele, the Humoresque by Dvorak, again ukulele and harp, Barcarolle by Offenbach, Sextet from Lucia by Donizetti. So these are very classical pieces played on the ukulele at a time when it was still in its infancy, still developing. And I think this review of her performances is very interesting, and I'd like to read that out to you. Miss Jenny Durkee recently appeared in Denver, Colorado at the Knight Campbell Music Store. She was advertised for a concert in the company hall. The house was packed. There were crowds outside waiting to get in. There was such a demand that a second concert was given the same evening, and still hundreds of people were turned away. Miss Durkee was received with the greatest enthusiasm. In addition, Miss Durkee also consented to appear at the noon concerts, which are given at the Denver Auditorium, which has a seating capacity of 12,000. Although it is never completely filled at these noon concerts, she did appear before 1,500 people playing with the big organ, and her ukulele was heard in every part of the hall. She was enthusiastically received here also, and had to respond to 2 encores. An excellent example of Miss Durkee's artistry, also proof that the ukulele, when properly played, can be heard in the largest halls. Now, I think what I failed to mention a little bit earlier, that she was also a guitarist and played the mandolin and the banjo as well. And she went from not even listening to a ukulele to becoming a ukulele fiend. So it's quite an interesting transformation. And I think my mind was quite blown when I read this, and to think of her playing on her ukulele with an organ as well, and in front of such a large audience without any amplification. Another interesting approach was the Santes and Nunes original method and self-instructor on the ukulele from 1915. And of course, Angeline Nunes was the daughter-in-law of Manuel Nunes, one of the first men to make ukuleles in Hawaii. Now, their method claimed to be for those who wanted to play the ukulele beyond just the mere strumming, although interestingly, quite a lot of the book is dedicated to the different strokes and to playing chords. But the most interesting thing, I think, here is that they claimed that the original way of tuning the ukulele was DGB-D, and that, of course, is the same tuning as the Madeiran machete. Now, it didn't catch on, and I think this would relate to what Jonathan was saying. With this tuning, the shapes are all different. So, you know, your G chord, it might be the same shape as a D chord on the guitar, but if you use this tuning, then it's not, it's messed up. But what I found particularly interesting, and here just to show you that they were using the chords as well as the melody, was this little note which said that the authors were arranging for piano and ukulele famous Hawaiian songs, classical and popular music, which they intend compiling into an extensive book. Now, I don't know if this happened. I've never found it. If anyone's found it, I'd love to hear from you. But I thought it almost sounds like a book that John King would publish. And I thought that was very, very interesting to note. So this was from 1915. So this is my little Hall of Fame for the people we've just looked at, and just to bring it home that, you know, Ernest Kai, one of the leading exponents, Hawaiian exponents of the ukulele, the man who took the ukulele all around the world, he was also a guitarist. You can see he's got this very beautiful, correct guitar technique, and then here he's holding the ukulele in the crook of his arm and appearing to be using the thumb technique, whereas here this is Vada Bickford, and again this very nice guitar technique, but she's using the same approach for the ukulele. Jenny Durkee, it's a bit hard to see what's going on here, but she also seems to have the ukulele in the crook of the arm. She's not holding her felt pick, seems to be using the thumb and fingers. And this is Angeline Nunes, who has a very guitar-like approach with her right hand. I don't know if she played the guitar. I don't know if Jim knows. It'd be interesting to find out. And then, of course, King John, with his beautiful classical right-hand technique. So what I wanted to say was that with looking at these people, the early history of the ukulele, we can see this constant conversation between the guitar and the ukulele. And John King's books really rekindled and revitalized that conversation that was seen in the early 1900s. And I'd also note how these early pioneers, they were all very individual, very innovative, and very bold in their approaches. And I think maybe that's something that, you know, we should continue to embrace as ukulele players, how there was a lot of experimenting going on and they were trying out different things, the felt pick, which I don't think anybody plays in that style anymore, but it would be great to hear someone, you know, playing this repertoire again. I think the same can be said of John King. He was also a great innovator because although he drew our attention to these people, he demonstrated how the campanella technique could be used so effectively on the ukulele. And of course, this has really been covered, the re-entrant tuning being the key thing here. But I liked this quote from James Tyler in his book, A Baroque Guitar and How to Play It. And he's talking about the re-entrant tuning of the Baroque guitar and how a chord become a neutral, nearly inversionless sound unit. So the chords are more like a color. And this is why the Baroque guitar and the ukulele are very good for recording for accompanying the human voice. We've also talked about the campanella, the little bell, but this idea of displaced notes which create overringing effects. And then a lovely quote from Lex Eisenhardt, this spacious over legato. And he also noted that at the time it represented a taste for idiosyncratic effects in instrumental music. And so what I really wanted to say was that this is still relevant today with the ukulele and how deep the roots of the ukulele actually go. King didn't talk about the Renaissance guitar, but I just want to finish up with that because I think it's it's so important to the ukulele. There's so much in common with the Renaissance guitar and the ukulele, and we haven't talked about that today because it had 4 courses of strings, or 4 double strings. And Christopher Page, in his book, The Guitar in Tudor England, actually described this image of a guitar in the Eglantine table as a double course Tudor ukulele. It's approximately the size of a concert ukulele. And this is a guitar, or gittern, from the Eglantine table in Hardwick Hall, Derbyshire. Now, it's a very plain instrument. There's a lute and a harp also on the table, and they're very ornate, perhaps indicating that they're instruments of a higher status. Whereas we see the guitar placed amongst the gaming boards, which Page notes are the pastimes of both prince and pauper. And this is a quote from Christopher Page, and he says, "Its presence there is a reminder of the instrument's ambiguous position at the point where written and unwritten traditions of music negotiated with each other, where the instrument could be strummed on the streets at one moment and played like a lute the next, making appropriately sophisticated music." And he could easily be talking about the ukulele today. And this, just to show you the tablature from Adrian Leroy from 1552, which you can play on your ukulele by reading this tab. So instead of having a 0, we have an A for an open string, and a B for a first fret, and a D for a third fret. And this music works wonderfully well. I've got some videos on YouTube which you might like to look up in your own time. And also, it was the main reason for commissioning the 5-string ukulele, so that I would have the low G and the high G, the double, the octave Gs as my 4th string. So to conclude, I would describe the Hawaiian ukulele as a coalescence of musical styles and technical approaches from the Renaissance to the machete of Madeira. I would also like to add that I don't know why John King chose to use the term classical ukulele, and I'm not going to try and answer that question. I would only say that my unease with the term classical ukulele is that it might imply elitism. But my hope in using the term classical ukulele is that it will help to change stereotypical views of the ukulele and encourage people to see the instrument for all its beautiful myriad possibilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for this incredible talk. Thank you so much from my side. But I really think that you opened up the Pandora's vase of many problems and aspects, and I very much appreciated your this interesting switch from the problem of the instrument to the problem of the cultural processes that an instrument can highlight. And I don't want to sound a little bit structuralistic, but I'm every time we make comparison with a cultural situation, the question remains how much a paradigm, how much a model is valid per se as a model, and how much is just a pattern that it's beneath the surface of human ways of making knowledge and music. I really have tons of questions for you. And I see also many comments, many thanks from our YouTube videos. But there's actually a very curious thing that I noticed when you showed this Spanish fandango. There's actually a piece by an almost unknown Italian guitarist called Maria Rita Brondi, which is called Melodia del Sannio, which is a melody from the Sannio region, the Abruzzi region, which is actually the same. And the author says that it has been transcribed by Maria Rita Brondi. So I'm wondering which kind of musical root this kind of melody, this kind of pattern could have had in the past. But I find it absolutely brilliant.
That's very interesting.
And I think that the problem of authenticity in transcription and the authenticity of the repertoire we're addressing in a transcription comes out as a very relevant problem. And I have a guess, but maybe maybe it's an easy one, but I would love to know, to get to know your opinion about it. Maybe John King uses the word classical to establish a standard. What do you think about it?
I think so. I think definitely. I definitely think that's there.
So now we have a classical something. Okay. Is there anyone who has question from our Zoom room? Otherwise we can, Jonathan, please.
Yeah, sure. I have questions. I have lots of questions, but I'll ask one. Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. Really, really interesting. I guess, thinking, and this term classical, right? It's this kind of like iffy thing, but then it's useful in some ways. So it's like kind of a broader, just in general, as like a kind of complicated term to talk about any kind of classical music. But whatever we want to call that tradition of European art music, one thing that seems distinctive in it is a certain relation to notation, right? Is that the written text is important in a certain way and kind of taken as your kind of starting point. There's kind of less improvisation as that tradition kind of becomes more text obsessed in the 19th century and so on. And I just love how you've traced through all these documents and it's really amazing. I wonder if you have other thoughts about a kind of oral tradition around the instrument and its related instruments that might be harder to recover, but whether you have hints of places where there was other kinds of playing and stuff happening that wasn't written down or wasn't starting from a book or something along those lines.
I think that's definitely an interesting question. And there is, of course, the Rajau from Madeira, which was taken to Hawaii as well. I missed that out because, well, there's just too much to cover and focused on the machete. But the Rajau in Hawaii was known as the tarapatch, and that was the 5-string instrument, and the top 4 strings of the ukulele, the tuning comes from that instrument, not the machete, although the small size of the machete is more like the ukulele. But the Rajau is a difficult instrument because it is exactly what you were saying, that it's not a written tradition. But what is interesting when I went to Madeira was that I was told by the musicians there that they would often remove the 4th string of the instrument to make it easier for people learning it. So in effect, it was a ukulele. So it was even being used as a ukulele in Madeira before it went to Hawaii. I think that's very interesting. And of course, some of the early photographs that we see of the ukulele in Hawaii, they're actually the tarapatch or the rajau, and they quite often have that string removed as well. But as to the music that was played on the rajau, I don't know. I'd love to know more, but I haven't as yet, unearthed anything. But I think that's an interesting point. And it's the same with the Renaissance guitar as well. We have this music from Leroy and other composers, but there was obviously a lot of music that was strummed, and maybe they had chord charts like the ukulele groups, and they were just handing them around. So yeah, I think there's a lot more, and we only tend to concentrate on the written traditions, which, well, I suppose that's what we have. We have the concrete evidence, and then we miss out on the other traditions, but we can only speculate on them or make educated guesses.
Thank you, Samantha. I think we have one more question, again from Rektim Patek. Thank you so much for all your questions. And he goes saying, I assume there are many parallels between classic ukulele and classic banjo. I mean, guitar style on 4-string banjo in re-entrant G, C, G, B, C tuning? Question mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's I've only really dipped into that, but and that kind of blew my mind when I realized there was, you know, a classical tradition, if you like, on the banjo. I mean, there's just so much more that we need to know about the ukulele and its, you know, relationship with other instruments. I feel that this is just, you know, scratching the surface. And I would say when I started my PhD, my first conversation with my supervisors was, I don't know if there's enough for a PhD. And they laughed at me. Now I understand why, because, you know, it's, you know, the deeper you go, the more there is, and there's so much. It sort of blows my mind every day. So maybe that's an area for, you know, someone to investigate. There's just so many channels.
Thank you. Well, I think that this conference will absolutely testify to everybody that there's absolutely room for improving research and a lot of space for it. So thank you very much again, Samantha. And
thank you.
Yeah. So we move to our last presentation of today's the first day of our first International Ukulele Conference. Our next speaker and my dear friend and co-director of this research project is Giovanni Albini. Giovanni is a composer, ukulelist, and music theorist. He is a tenured professor and head of research at the Conservatorio of Alessandria in Piedmont. And he also teaches composition at the Conservatorio della Svizzera Italiana in Lugano, Switzerland. He has researched the use of quantitative methods in music and composition, developing a personal and unique mathematically informed aesthetics. Recordings of his music are published by Brilliant Classics. And moreover, he commissions and performs new contemporary classical music written for the ukulele and arranged classical and renowned contemporary and 20th century scores for it, as we have seen in some of the video during this day, fostering the development of a new, challenging, and cultivated ukulele repertoire, and aiming to deepen and evolve the idiomatic, unique features of the instrument. So thank you so much, Giovanni, and I leave you the floor.
Thank you, Giovanni, and can you hear me? I hope so. And thank you, everybody. And in particular, thank you again to Jonathan, Fabrizio, and Samantha. Now I have something to think about. I try to focus on what I have to say and not to think about ideas about what sparkled out of your beautiful speeches. So my speech is about the unique, or what I consider unique, in ukulele's arranging features that I have tackled in my experience from both the points of view of the arranger and of the performer. And as you notice, I think I'm a composer, but I have not composed that much for the instruments yet. I don't know why, really. Perhaps I just want now to go deep and deep in experiencing the instrument from a performative and from an arranging point of view. I don't know. Well, the ukulele's capability in allowing music adaptations as a solo instrument or for accompanying the voice, for instance, is undoubtedly unquestionable. Since its origins, as we have seen in other presentations, the ukulele literature has consisted, for the most part, of arrangements. It is my guess this could be explained with two main reasons. First of all, the ukulele is mostly an instrument for the amateur performer, who usually just wishes to reproduce well-known music on a comfortable and handy instrument. Secondly, performing on the ukulele is something that usually needs a wider instrumentation or less limited instruments, exhibits virtuosity and shows the unique and perhaps even unexpected capabilities of such a small instruments. Jonathan told us size matters, and that this is very true in the context of the ukulele. The latter issue is, in my opinion, quite evident in almost all the ukulele methods, regardless of performing style and year of publishing. As we can see, for instance, in the shown quotation, where the underlying words emphasize the musical complexity the ukulele can handle, despite its alleged limitations. In this context, the aim of this speech is to try to explain how and why an instrument of such apparent and limited resources can be so effective for arranging music. A preliminary and the manifest issue is the limited range of a standard ukulele, featuring the typical reentrant C tuning, high G, that extends usually from C4 to A5 over a 13th. Indeed, we know that many instruments, especially the ones of bigger scales, often overcome today's such limitation, featuring some more frets, therefore extending the range to a span of about 2 octaves. After all, even during the determinant 1926 meeting of the National Association of Musical Instrument and Accessories Manufacturers held in Buffalo, New York, it was decided that ukuleles had to have at least 12 frets. And even Madeiran machetes and early ukuleles sometimes featured more than 12 frets. Anyway, let us consider the most limited and common range of a 13th and notice that it nearly corresponds to the safe vocal range of a soprano voice type. That's also, let me add, I didn't write it down, but now it has sparkled to my mind that the range of a child is inside that range too. So that's interesting. Moreover, the vocal range is almost the same for the other voice types. Therefore, any singable melody can be reproduced on a ukulele by the means of a proper transposition. Finally, if we consider the 4 fundamental voice types, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, we notice that high G and low G ukulele tunings could cover them all by the only means of octave transpositions. So we don't need to think that much, let's say. So we have a first possible answer for the question I made. The range of a ukulele mirrors the human voice one, therefore any singable melody can be reproduced on it. Such range is indeed limited, but let me put it this way, on a human scale. Another relevant and well-known, as we could see in the other presentation, characteristic of the conventional reentrant tuning of the ukulele is the interval of a measured second between the first and the fourth string. Such interval allows to place melodic notes across the 2 outer strings, enabling the over-ringing effect of finger-picking campanella technique, and also to easily split a melody on the 2 strings during strumming, adding several possibilities and also cutting back on left and fourth. This, along with the short scale of the ukulele that makes it possible to reach quite wide intervals, is indeed useful, for instance, for chord melody arrangements, and we know how many of them are out there. Just an example is the given bar, where a simple melody moves from the first string to the fourth one and back with minimal left-hand movements. Okay. Here is another example where a Spanish composer, John Galvez, makes an intensive use of the campanella technique through all the 4 strings of the ukulele, in this case, in a finger-picking arrangement of a traditional Irish tune. It is very short and we can listen to it. So I'd ask our kind technician.
Okay, please, Giovanni. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Moreover, 4 strings handled by 4 fingers, sometimes 5, okay, but that was a trick, allow chords made up of a maximum of 4 different pitches, enough, as we know when we study harmony, to clearly render tonal chords and without the burden of stopping or skipping many unwanted open strings. All of this lead us to another 2 good answers to our question. Answer 2, reentrant tuning is particularly suitable for chord melody arrangements. And answer 3, 4 strings offer a balance between achievable harmonic complexity and left-hand workability. Therefore, as we have very much experienced it, I think, songs can be easily adapted on ukuleles. Let me also point this out. Sometimes we think about the ukulele as a small instrument. In my opinion, it is not that small. It is balanced. It is small enough. That's another thing. A small instrument is a sopranino ukulele. So you can get smaller and smaller if you want. What is the limit? But the right word, I think, here is balance. There is an equilibrium in number of strings, in scale length, in everything. And I have to say so because now I was born as a guitarist before getting to be a composer. Now I'm still a composer and a theorist, but I'm also a ukulelist. And I cannot play guitar anymore. It looks to me so big, you know. And if I think that my fiancé play at the organ, when I see that, I say, well, wow, that's like big building, that's huge. That's impossible to manage for me. I'm not saying now that these instruments are too big, of course. I'm just saying that, in my opinion, the ukulele is not small. That's another thing. Or, well, it is not under my perception. And I think and I feel that even for me, and I'm quite a big guy, it's balanced. And that's important. That's what I wanted to underline. So let's go back to my statement. Therefore, songs can be easily adapted. Well, yet songs are not the only kind of music we could wish to adapt on it. And being a contemporary music composers and lover, I like to adapt almost anything from the classical and modern repertoire for the ukulele. In this respect, I think that the difficulty in trying to arrange a variety of musical styles for ukulele is partially overcome thanks to the vast assortment of instrumental kinds and performing techniques that have been used during history by the performers, sometimes borrowing such techniques from other instruments. I guess that the cultural, adaptive, ever-changing nature of the ukulele from historical, organological, and performative perspective is the golden key of its success. As luthiers, arrangers, composers, and performers, we have reinvented it every day, paying tribute to its ancestors and tradition, and yet setting it in ever new musical contexts. As a performer, I'm also a collector, and that's something easy with ukulele that are not so expensive, as Fabrizio pointed out. Well, not all of them, at least. Sometimes, when I feel stuck studying a piece on an instrument, I change instrument. And I find new ways for playing it, and I go back to the original instrument. So every instrument has its own identity, and I try to have a collection that is the most diversified possible in this way. But let me say that it's something kind of typical and unique for an instrument. I don't know an ukulelist that has just one instrument. Okay. This, I think, leads us to the 4th answer to our question. The ukulele technique borrows elements from any musical setting it has been in contact with. And because of its inner simplicity, it easily adapts to them. Yesterday, I had a beautiful conversation because I invited him in my Conservatorio ukulele class with Danilo Vignola, who learned the ukulele while learning flamenco techniques. And now he's playing, yes, flamenco on the ukulele, but in a mixed way, in a guitar ukulele way. We cannot say that's really guitar flamenco on the ukulele. And these little instruments, because of his simplicity, but simplicity here is used not in, of course, denigrating way, but simply trying to underline how it can be adaptive. It doesn't get broken when related to other culture. And this instrument, because it's very popular, has been traveling so much, and we can find it in a lot of different musical settings, and also in a lot of different kinds, size and type and materials and whatever. And any of these experience creates something new for this open identity that the instrument has. A first example, personal example, of course, now I could offer is an arrangement of mine of Tchaikovsky's Cherubic Hymn for choir. So I loved this piece, but the very slow tempo of the piece and its long sung notes seemed not to be a good fit for the plucked sound of the ukulele, that is characterized by a quite short decay. I didn't want to use any kind of amplification or tricks. Nevertheless, a very fast and delicate arpeggio, as it is commonly done on a classical guitar, can render an effective textural effect, fixing the issue. We can then perhaps listen to the beginning of this arrangement of mine, and you can tell me if you like and if you think I could find a way to fix it.
Okay, so we played the second video, Giovanni.
Thank you so much.
Okay, please, Giovanni.
Thank you. In this other example of this very famous piece by Mozart that is usually performed in the Christmas time now, I wanted to replicate at least the feeling of novelty introduced in the original score by the entrance of the choir at bar 3. So I have stolen another guitar technique that I have usually seen on electric guitars that I don't play, for instance. Left-hand fingertip muting that creates an interesting and different muffled sound. So you just put your finger very, very close to the capo. This is the muffled sound. This is the original sound. And you create, so you can really create two different instruments performing now. And I have been struggling because, of course, in a lot of, so now I performed at the beginning, so we cannot play the video perhaps, Giovanni, then. And one issue that you have with an instrument like the ukulele, where you have limited range is to try to differentiate timbrically some melodies, some areas, some sections. And so every way you can find to create a new sound on the instrument, it works. Harmonics are a perfect example, and another solution here, for instance. Okay, I moved to another octave there, but why not? And so on. And this is just another example. So I wake up in the morning and I try every time to say to myself, let's find something that looks impossible to be done, and let's do it with just, like in this case, two voices counterpoint, trying to still render the piece. Because another thing that I love about arranging is that let you think about the core of the music, of a musical style, of a musical language. So when you have enough to tell that you are giving the most important content of the music you are arranging, and again, with the ukulele, you can always go to that core, I think. You can judge it and you can tell me what you think. Perhaps I've not been always successful, but somebody else I'm sure will be. And also the other aspect is that you can do it in different ways, because I'm sure that if I give this, if we make a challenge, something like for television, having a piece and then give it to 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 ukuleles and say, okay, let's arrange it. I'm sure there will come out a lot of different interesting arrangements and solutions. So this freedom, again, in this limitation, it means that we are not so limited there, but we have enough constraints to let our brain burn and to evolve the instrument technique. Of course, there are really so many other examples I could offer about this topic of borrowing techniques, but perhaps the best I can do is just showing a famous movie appearance that most of you still know from the 1930s of the great Wizard of the Strings, Royce Mack, and ask you to try to count and relate to other instrumental techniques the many techniques he put on the table. So please, let's play this final impressive video. That is also, I think, the beginning. I think this is the first video with tapping, but I'm not sure about that. I don't want to say something. Okay, I've already said it, but.
Okay, Giovanni, it's over.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. As you can see, Royce Mack was a multi-instrumentalist. But sometimes, I always like to say that I don't play ukulele, I play ukuleles. And so in a way, we are multi-instrumentalists too, poly-instrumentalists too. I don't know the right English term, perhaps I'm using some false friends, but I hope you can understand. Because we all play ukulele mixing several techniques. We can just think about what Samantha just said in her presentation about the classical ukulele, and then she moved out, and then she moved in, and then she moved out and moved in with the techniques. So last but not least, I think it is important to underline how the alleged limitation and the small balanced size of the ukulele, that is too commonly perceived as little more than a toy, make it a perfect instrument to enhance virtuosistic effects. For the aforesaid reason, it makes possible what can appear to be impossible on it. The ukulele's apparent limitations make then arrangements to be wonderfully unexpected. And it also, in my opinion, attenuate their eventual imperfections. It's like a little kid dancing so well, but if a little kid makes some mistakes, we can forgive him, in a way. And now I'm just trying perhaps to be forgiven for my imperfections. I don't know, really, because I wasn't a good guitarist, and I think I'm not a good ukulelist too, perhaps, but let's limit to it. Okay. And that's all. I think I'm right, giving 5 minutes for questions. So these are just few of the reasons why I love this instrument also so much. And I enjoy deepening it from many perspectives also. So it's not just reasons because it is so good for arranging. This is why I love it so much. When I wake up during vacation, I cannot wait for Christmas. Finally, I will have time for arranging and playing new pieces. Okay, sorry, I'm going personal. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for this amazing talk. And and also for providing a kind of circular ending for this first day of our conference, connecting many thoughts and many ideas that spread out from these four amazing presentation from my side. Thank you so much for this great opportunity and for enriching this wonderful conference with these really four wonderful contributions. So a big applause to all the people in this room, and thank you so much also for all the audience which is following this event. We reached a kind of 500 people in a row. So thank you so much for following with so many this event. We have wonderful comments for you, Giovanni, but actually no questions. I have a very personal one, if I can address it to you. And I got to know your musical persona. I use this term borrowed from popular music as a composer, and I got to know your desire for essentiality. Probably this is it's a better word than simplicity. In composing, and now I'm kind of tracking it down in your career, in your activity as an ukulele player. So I'm going to ask you, how do you think your playing the ukulele changed your perspective as a composer? Do you think that playing the ukulele has a transformative power on you as a composer?
Yes, I think so. So I was lying when I was saying that I'm not composing anymore. I'm composing a little bit less because I'm very busy, but playing and with academic duties as well. But now, for instance, I'm working on a piece for children choir and ukulele. And I notice that I can really go to the point, to the core, to this elemental, material. And yes, I think it is more than changing me, it is helping me doing something I was already doing. And that's all, I think. So it's an instrument where, and also it's if it is changing me and changed me in a way, it is that I have been not performing for long, and I couldn't appreciate music anymore that much. And the practical side, the human side, the music at hand, it is something that really, really changed you. It was like having a wife living away, you know, and you say, okay, I think I love her, but I cannot see her, you know, so I can't experience her anymore, not in the right way, perhaps. And in this way, you know, my relationship with music. So you're very right. I'm doing exactly what I usually do as a composer, as a theorist, because doing with mathematical music theory, usually I try to go to some core, you know, ideas that can be representative of patterns and bigger elements and bigger. So that's the same. So I have an instrument where I can have a closer, I feel a closer relationship with music. I can fail. And that's something fantastic. In composition, we don't really fail. We don't feel ashamed when we fail, because the failure is can be hidden somewhere. Then I can erase it on my computer, but here I can fail. When I do a concert, I fail. When I perform, I fail, and that's fantastic. It's you know, I know that I'm living because I'm dying at every fail in a way. So I'm just saying that, I think, because when I introduced this instrument in my conservatoire, I told my rector that the ukulele is the perfect second instrument, because you are a musician and then you have an instrument that with which you can do everything. And it's like a mirror for yourself. It's a mirror for the culture in which you see it. So perhaps I see the ukulele as a musical mirror. So that's why you have all that freedom. If you are free, if you are doing something with a lot of enthusiasm, then you have your mirror, and the ukulele is a mirror. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting romantic. You know me.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for this kind of poetic ending to this day. So, okay, if there are no more questions, and it seems so, I think that we can we can say goodbye for today. So thank you so much again to our wonderful speaker. Thanks to Jonathan de Souza, Fabrizio Nastari, Samantha Muir, and Giovanni Albini for providing such a good start to this conference. So we're gonna meet tomorrow at 5 Central Europe time.
Again, let's thank also Jim Trancada and Davide Tonelli that have been with us, and even today. Thank you so much. You are preparing yourself for tomorrow, so you are sneaking in. I'm joking. We wanted you in, but
yes.
Thank you so much, because we know now I'm going to dinner. There's somebody going to have breakfast now. So it's fantastic.
Awesome. So tomorrow we're going to have, our second keynote speaker, Jim Trancada, and then Davide Donelli, and then Mimo Peruffo, and the final round table moderated by myself that will really try to put together all this puzzle